And, one of the reasons that we in our campaign have focused so much on the cultural side of things in terms of having art contests and music contests is that I really think, if you think of the way change happens in the world as like a river, by the time government passes something, you're already way down at the mouth of the river. You're not quite at the mouth of the river because the mouth is what is actually enforced, which is only a fraction of what the government approves. But in order to get something to happen on the legal front, first you need all of that cultural change happening way upstream. So, I think we've got a lot of brilliant people who are able to put the necessary information out there and educate people, but we also need to change how people feel in relation to the natural world. And that's where I think the arts and music and culture more broadly are crucial. And I would love to see the rights of nature really be a rallying cry for a whole new era of art and cultural change, because it's incredibly disruptive, this idea that rights shouldn't only apply to humans. So we have to have a mix of patience and impatience, right? We need to feel the urgency that the natural world is being destroyed right now, and we need to do something about it. But also the zoomed out patience of recognizing that these things do take time. By the time women were given the right to vote in this country, or recognized with the right to vote, how many decades, how many centuries did it take to lay the groundwork for that moment? And so, with regards to the rights of nature, we're probably going to see quite a number of defeats on the way to a more substantial, comprehensive victory.
Welcome to Truth and Reckoning, a broadcast from CELDF. In this show, we'll learn from frontline organizers and communities fighting against environmental destruction. We'll explore different perspectives and innovative strategies for movement building, the potency and the potential of rights of nature, and effective action in defense of our communities. And we'll share inspiring stories of people working towards right relationship with the land and each other. I am your host, Max Wilbert. Here with Tom Grotewohl. Am I saying your name correctly, Tom?
Well done.
Thank you. We're doing an interview today. We're going to make this more of a conversation. We're going to discuss Tom's work in co-founding an organization called Protect the Porkies to oppose a massive copper mine, which Tom actually calls a toxic waste mine because that's mostly what it will produce in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. So, Tom, would you introduce yourself a little bit? Who you are, your background, how you got involved in this, and then I can introduce myself and we can go from there.
Sure. Well, as you said, my name is Tom Grotewohl. I'm a resident of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. My family and I, we live over in the westernmost UP, almost to Wisconsin, and we are fortunate to have found a home right next to Lake Superior, which is the largest, cleanest source of surface fresh water on the continent, right next to the Porcupine Mountains, which is Michigan's largest remaining original forest. Like many places, over 99% of Michigan's original forest was lost. And I've got some old growth forest in my backyard. So this is a really incredible spot. Also, right next to the North Country Trail, the longest of all national hiking trails. So when my family and I learned that this beautiful place, which was important not only to us, but to hundreds of thousands of people who visit here every year, and of course, all of the life forms who call this area home, when we learned that this place was actually being considered for this copper sulfide mine, a highly disruptive project, all for the sake of copper to be shipped out of country, and there were no other human residents in the area to speak up, we decided that the easiest thing we could do was to start a website, start a petition, and just put some information out there. We didn't really have in mind starting a campaign or playing a leadership role. We just thought, let's be a messenger, put the information out there, and let folks make up their own minds. And the campaign gained a lot of momentum last year when the state of Michigan actually began considering funding this mine with 50 million taxpayer dollars. So that really put it on the radar of a lot of folks from around Michigan and beyond. So that's kind of a recap of where we are right now. But Protect the Porkies has also branched out into other directions. We're also engaged in dark skies activism, and we hope to begin fomenting the rights of nature movement as well over in our neck of the woods.
Fantastic. And we first connected, what, a year or two ago now to discuss this on a previous show to discuss your work. So I'm glad to be with you now for an update to learn what you guys have been up to and what's next, what you're looking towards. But since we're kind of switching things up here, doing this a little bit differently, we're going to be distributing this show via our Celdiff channels, and Tom's also going to be distributing it via his own channels. We're going to make this a conversation, so I should introduce myself too,
Yes,
assuming
please.
that many people who will be listening on your end don't know who I am and my background. My name is Max Wilbert. I live in Oregon, and Tom and I connected because I co-founded a mine resistance group back in 2021 to fight a project called the Thacker Pass lithium mine, which is located in northern Nevada. We unfortunately we've lost that fight now. The mine is being constructed, but we fought very hard for 3 years to stop that project. We set up a protest camp on the ground and held that space for almost a year. We organized with tribes and environmental groups and local people from across the region. We assisted in filing multiple federal lawsuits against the project, building media pressure, bringing pressure campaigns to bear on politicians and contractors and different folks who are involved in the project, and taking nonviolent direct action, actually blockading the construction and going out to try and stop what was happening out there. So that was the context in which Tom and I initially connected. Was let's share some strategies. Let's discuss what works well and what doesn't. Let's talk about the differences and similarities between these two projects, how they're being sold to the public, and how we can push back against those narratives. So these days I work with an organization called the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, which it was really a pioneer of the rights of nature movement in the United States and in some ways around the world as well. And I specialize in community resistance and resilience within Celdiff. And so I work to support folks like you who are doing grassroots work, opposing projects like this around the country. I've been supporting some folks in logging resistance, in fighting the border wall construction down on the U.S.-Mexico border. And then I'm a writer as well, a writer and community organizer. So I've been involved in this type of work for many, many years now. That's a
Yeah,
little
and
bit about me.
I do recommend the book you co-authored, Bright Green Lies, to quite a number of folks in the movements. First, I recommend to them Ozzy Zenner's book, Green Illusions, as sort of a soft introduction to these themes, and then Bright Green Lies for folks who really want to rip the Band-Aid right off, because it's important that as all of us are fighting these individual battles, we also take a moment to zoom out and look at the deeper narratives that are fueling these fights. Otherwise, it's just, we're putting out bushfires and we don't have a larger view of what the deeper agendas are. Max, so the company that is now constructing the Thacker Pass mine, it sounds like they're quite a large player. After everything you guys threw at them, federal lawsuits, it seems like this is probably a very significant company with deep pockets to have been able to withstand that and come out on the other end. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, it wasn't so much like that in the beginning. When they were in the early prospecting stages, the company actually wasn't called Lithium Americas Corporation. It was that company purchased the mining claims later on in the I think it was in the 2000 teens. The original company was kind of a small exploratory company, and they didn't really have any mining experience. This is really common across the mining sector, that you'll see these sort of small, scrappy, startup style mining companies go in and do the exploration, sort of verify if there are minerals in a given site, and then work to sell their mining claims to larger companies that actually have the capital to develop these projects. So this is kind of an established business plan and model. But even when we started opposing the Thacker Pass lithium mine in 2021, it was a pretty small company. They probably had some tens of millions of dollars in the bank. They weren't tiny by any means, but they were small in terms of the mining industry. And that's because they weren't an established company. They didn't have any mining operations up and running that were generating revenue from them. So all the money that they had was essentially investor money that had been put in to see, can we get a return on these projects? Um, and that situation is still to some extent true. There was a period through 2021, 2022, where they co-owned a lithium project that did begin producing lithium down in Argentina, and around that time, they actually in 2023, I believe, they actually split those companies off from one another. So the company that's down in Argentina is now a separate company. They did a stock split, and so any owners, now ended up owning both companies separately. And they did that to try and secure access to financing, because there was the other co-owner of the mine in Argentina was a Chinese company, and that created difficulties when they were looking for funding inside the U.S. That they had these links to China because of geopolitics. These companies have now split. The U.S. based company is a subsidiary of a Canadian company. So Lithium Americas is the Canadian parent, and Lithium Nevada is the Nevada based child company, fully owned subsidiary. And at this point, they still don't have revenue. They won't be bringing in revenue from the mine for years, but they've gotten a lot of money to come in. They got a $650 million investment from General Motors,
Mm.
and then they got a $2.26 billion loan from the U.S. Department of Energy. So they are flush with cash, and they're developing the project as we speak. But it seems like on your end, the company that's behind the Copperwood mine project proposal at this point is still quite small and is still in the stage of seeking funding. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. They're exactly what you were describing of these early scrappy startup companies. I've heard them described as junior companies because even though they market themselves as mining companies, if you've never owned or operated or developed a mine, that's not really an accurate description of your purpose. So this same company called Highland Copper, um, their Michigan company is called Copperwood Resources, but of course, the parent company is based out of Toronto, as many companies are. And they previously owned two mining proposals. The first is the Copperwood project on the west side of the state park, Porcupine Mountain State Park, and the other is the White Pine North mine, which would be the reopening of a historic copper sulfide mine in the Upper Peninsula over on the east side of the state park. And because they've had such a hard time raising funds for the Copperwood mine, initially they sold off 66% of their shares at that White Pine North extension, and they earned $30 million from that sale. They sold it to another Canadian mining company, this one with more extensive experience and deeper pockets, named Kentera. And their most recent financial statement from September read that they had around $9 million on hand. And this is for a project. The Copperwood mine is expected to cost around 450 million, and that's probably not even including inflation and continued inflation over the coming years, which will make those costs much larger. However, just about a week ago, they announced that they have sold off the rest of their remaining shares of the White Pine North project, and they earned another 30 million minus 12 million they owned in interest. And so they've now got about $30 million in the bank, which is still less than 10% of the funding that they need. However, they are actively pursuing $50 million from the state of Michigan, which would pay for the power grid expansion, the cell towers, and the road upgrades. All wonderful things to have right in the buffer zone of an old growth wilderness area. And that's something we're really trying to educate our followers on is For many people, this is not even about mining. It's about once you roll all of that infrastructure out, you're opening the floodgates for all sorts of developments, including data centers, which has already been mentioned by a UP lawmaker that the power grid would open the floodgates for data centers. And so we really need to draw a line in the sand around this area because the Porcupine Mountains are uh, they're ranked as one of the most beautiful state parks in the country. So from a purely human perspective, this is a sanctuary space that people need to go to get a break from all of those hectic city influences. So that Michigan funding, it's been blocked 3 times now. Last year, it was going to go directly towards the mining company, and we mobilized thousands of people to write to lawmakers, call lawmakers. We made in-person trips to Michigan's capital, and then over the winter, because we really caught them off guard last year, they didn't see us coming. And so over the winter, they re strategized. And this year, they reintroduced the same $50 million, but they said it was going to the local township, not the mining company. And they rebranded it as community infrastructure funding, even though almost the exclusive purpose was to help the mine advance. We educated our community and managed to get that funding blocked again for the third time in October of this year, but we've been told that perhaps in the final weeks of 2025, there's just a few weeks left, they might try to slip the funding through again as a supplemental in the Michigan budget. So right now we're staying very vigilant. And then the other source of funding that's been proposed is a $250 million debt financing package from from the Export Import Bank of the United States, which is a federal credit agency. And they've received a letter of interest which is completely non-binding, but so many of these projects they advance through, it feels like sorcery. It's completely speculative. So they haven't received 250 million, but they can show the prospect of 250 million to investors, which then attracts other funding sources, which then makes the project more serious and more likely to be approved for the 250 million. So, there's quite a number of sleights of hand that occur. If that money were to be approved, 250 million is quite a significant chunk of the startup funding that they need. But we're not quite sure at this moment of the strategy to be employed for a federal credit union or a federal credit agency. That's very different from interacting with lawmakers, in which they're actively concerned about how their constituents feel. So we're engaging in a different strategy on that front. And then we have some macroeconomic factors like the recent declaration that copper is a critical mineral, according to the US Geological Survey. That doesn't really work in our favor, but there's some nuance to be teased out there because the USGS has declared copper a critical mineral, but it really only applies to refined copper, which is copper that has gone through all stages of processing. And in this case, that would take place in Canada. So we'd be helping to produce a critical mineral for Canada. Meanwhile, mined copper, there is no observable shortage in the active supply, and thus there's no urgency to accelerate new mining projects. But the mining company, when they make these announcements to investors, there's no room for nuance. So all they say is copper is a critical mineral. They don't say it doesn't apply to mined copper. It's all about extrapolating the copper boom, which is always just around the corner. In the last few years, we were being told it was for green energy. Now we're being told it's for national security and, of course, data centers. So the narrative is ever shifting. The bottom line is they want that copper and they want it now, and they don't have the money to pay for it, which is why they're looking for Michigan to pay for it, and they're looking to take out debt from a federal credit agency. So that's kind of the current status of where the mine is at in terms of funding. But one of the real tragedies is that even though the project lacks almost all of its funding and all of its preliminary infrastructure, they've already destroyed nearly 60 acres of wetlands. They've permanently rerouted streams. They've clear cut many dozens of acres of forest. And it's all in full compliance with the permitting process in Michigan, which is why, in addition to just challenging the project and its permits every way we can, we are trying to project into the conversation that we need a deeper reimagining of how environmental permitting works. Why should speculative, unfunded projects be able to inflict lasting damage on nature? And that's also what leads me to have interest in the rights of nature movement as a way to maybe propose something new, a new paradigm which is actually much more objectively fair for all life forms.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting, Tom, to hear some of these details because the similarities with Thacker Pass, of course, continue, and with so many other projects, because these mines and large infrastructure projects of all sorts, to such a large extent, end up being public-private partnerships in reality, if even if they're not being sold or discussed in that way. And of course, people have talked about this for a long time, using the sort of saying that it's socialism for the rich and capitalism, sort of dog eat dog capitalism for the poor, right? We see the federal government trying to cut food stamps and cut off basic social assistance programs for working class people, and at the same time, food stamps for mining companies um, are flowing without any sort of restriction. And in fact, at Thacker Pass, the way we saw this play out was the mine was initially permitted under the Trump administration in January of 2021. They released the permit on January 15th, so it was 9 days after the January 6th riot in Washington D.C. at the Capitol. And then under the Biden administration, we saw the Democrats sort of defend the project in many different ways. They actually claimed in some of their documents, in some of their press releases under Biden, that the Biden White House was responsible for advancing and permitting the project. So they were claiming this sort of achievement for their own because the Biden White House obviously wanted to promote lithium and electric cars and the development of that sort of so-called clean energy economy, clean tech economy, um, and the jobs and so on that would allow them to build a certain narrative around that. And now under the Trump administration, once again, we've seen the money from the DOE, Department of Energy loans start to flow to Lithium Nevada, and we've actually seen the federal government buy into the Thacker Pass lithium mine. So Trump made some noise for a little while about pulling this Department of Energy loan, but what he actually ended up doing was using that as leverage to actually become a partner in the project. So the federal government is now a 5% owner of Lithium Nevada Corporation, and they also have an additional 5% stake in the Thacker Pass mine itself. And so it's a very clear picture that's being painted that there is a direct partnership between the government and private corporations to develop these resources, these mineral deposits. And if you know U.S. history, that's not surprising at all, because the history of the United States, from the founding of the initial colonies through the Revolution, westward expansion, and so on, has been a story of the government working to advance its own imperial power and economic strength through developing quote unquote natural resources. And if that's at the expense of the people, of the planet, of water, of native communities, and of the future, then that hasn't really been a consideration at all. And so, we're seeing with your project up there, with trying to fight this copperwood mine, the early stages of that, where the government is sort of flirting with providing this funding. But it's good that you guys are getting there ahead of the fact, because by the time we got to Thacker Pass and set up camp on the day that permit was approved, January 15th, 2021, there was already agreements in place with the local county for major tax abatements. The mining company was already, good friends and had well-established working relationships with state officials and so on. And so we were behind the curve. And we knew that at the time. Our decision making was, this is the first big lithium mine project in the country. So we feel a need to intervene, even though we're behind the curve. And we know that we're probably unlikely to be able to stop this thing. We made a decision we need to jump in, because simply from a narrative perspective and a movement shaping perspective, we want to fight this thing to try and raise awareness of the fact that this lithium green green energy electric car economy is not a substantive answer to the ecological crisis we're facing or the global warming crisis, you know. So so we decided to jump in, but it's good that you guys are ahead of the curve because there's a potential to try and jump in that crack, those limited cracks that do exist between the company and certain parts of the government, and sort of wedge those apart and pry those apart as much as possible.
Right. Yeah, I mean, every project and thus every resistance campaign is going to be completely different in terms of the playbook that's available to them. You know, in our case, we're ahead of the curve in some ways in that the company doesn't have the financing and the funding that they need. But unfortunately, we're behind the curve in that they already have nearly all of their permits approved by the state of Michigan, which maybe is a less successful mode of resistance anyway, because permitting agencies tend to approve almost everything as long as the right boxes are checked and all the t's are crossed and i's dotted. So we believe that trying to halt any substantial funding of this project is the probably our best shot forward. There is one other concerning federal development with regards to the Copperwood mine, not to the Copperwood mine directly, but their largest investor is Orion Mine Finance, which is a very large mine financing firm based in the Cayman Islands. And they have just joined in a $1.8 billion consortium with the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, so part of the U.S. government, and the United Arab Emirates. So this is $1.8 billion dollars. Each of these entities is putting forward $600 million dollars, and specifically for the securing of critical minerals like copper. And since this is Highland Copper's largest investor, it is an area of concern. um, that said, Orion Mine Finance is invested in loads of projects. You know, I think they probably fling a few million, few tens of millions here and there, and just see what seeds sprout down the line. But it is concerning that now we're seeing this partnership between the U.S. government, um, mining financing firms, and the United Arab Emirates, which is a country with a really mixed human rights record, at the same time as we're being told, America first all the way. Our government is joining forces with some of uh, the least ethical entities in the world to continue extraction. So that is something we'll have to keep our eyes on. Um, in the meantime, since we are, a very small campaign with very limited funding, we try to market ourselves as a decentralized movement. And what we mean by that is, I think too often people look to organizations to solve their problems. Organizations are great, and we need 501c3 nonprofit organizations doing a lot of work, but we also need people not to feel like individuals can just sit back on the couch and let organizations do all the groundwork for them. So that's why from day one of our campaign, we've encouraged direct participation from folks, whether that means writing to the company's investors, writing to Michigan's regulators. We've, of course, engaged with Michigan lawmakers. But then last year, we hosted a water walk in collaboration with several Native American tribes in the area. And we're going to be hosting another water walk next year as well. And this is a really important opportunity because in the Upper Peninsula, we hear all the time, mining is our heritage, mining is our heritage. This is kind of a slogan that gets repeated. And it really depends on how you're defining heritage, right? If you're only looking at a few companies owned by outsiders who managed to make a lot of money in the last 150 years as your heritage, then yeah, mining is our heritage. But if you're actually looking at all the thousands of years that this area has had human inhabitants who somehow managed to live here all that time without contaminating the water and poisoning the land, then that question of what our heritage is needs to really be opened up quite a lot to include the native people, which is why we're excited to be collaborating on another water walk next year. And that kind of brings us up to date with where we are now. We really can't think ahead too far because we may potentially need to be battling this Michigan funding just in the next couple weeks. So we're letting folks take a break from all of our action requests and potentially calling upon them to summon their final reserves of energy this year just in the next couple weeks. But I wonder, when you think back on Thacker Pass, you frame it as you call it a loss because that's what we say when things don't go the way we wanted. But do you think is there anything that could have been done to stop a project like that? It seems like you guys threw literally every idea and had just so much momentum and energy on your side. But at the end of the day, if you have these massive, well-funded interests, was there a secret trick that could have been employed, or is this just how the cards fall when we're working with small campaigns against entities with tens of millions, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars?
Yeah, and it's not only that. I mean, in the case of Thacker Pass, you have, like I said, you have the government being weaponized against people and the community members, and so the county government, the state government, Nevada's senators and congressional delegation, and the federal government as a whole were all lined up behind the project, which meant that from the beginning, you have law enforcement agencies oriented against people, oriented against the interests of the land. And, again, if you look at United States history, this is the norm. Whether we're talking about recent history and you look at Standing Rock and all of the law enforcement agencies, as well as the National Guard that were mobilized against people there to protect the rights of an oil company to build an oil pipeline that, has since leaked multiple times and caused and is causing many of the harms that people predicted it would. So you not only have sort of the administrative and monetary apparatus of capitalism and the state combined, but you also have sort of the force, the power, the armed power of the state mobilized to protect these projects. And that's ultimately what we're sort of trying to achieve when we, for example, contest projects in court. If somebody defies a court order, then the judge will order police to go enforce the court order. And that essentially means sending armed men to say, no, you're not actually allowed to do that. And if you do, we're going to handcuff you and take you away to lock you in a room, right? This is, I think it's important to not lose sight of this, because so often in the United States, I think we get caught up in these narratives and these ideas around democracy and rule of the people. And these are really beautiful and important aspirations. But it's also important to recognize that that's not the reality of how power functions by and large in this country. Largely, it is a question of who has money, who has political power. And if they do, then they have the armed power of the state backing them up, regardless of what's right or not. And so, for example, at Thacker Pass, many people looked at the judge ruling multiple times against environmental groups, against tribes, and they said, well, that must mean the mine is okay. That must mean the mine is good. But judges don't rule on morality. They don't just decide, this is what should be done. This is what's right. Judges look at the law and they say, does this meet the definition of the law or not? Does this meet the thresholds that are established in the law? And federal mining law, which is what applied to Thacker Pass because it was on federal land. That's the difference between your project there, which is on private land, and Thacker Pass, which is BLM, Bureau of Land Management, federally owned land, public land, is that the mining law protects the interests of mining companies. The mining laws and the 1872 mining law, which dates back to when Ulysses Grant was president, and the aftermath of the Civil War, that's the law of the land when it comes to mining. And so the judge actually said in some of her rulings, yes, Thacker Pass is a sacred place to Native people. Yes, I can see how this is very distressing that this is happening. But she basically said, the law says that this mine is legal, so I have to permit it to go forward. Um, she doesn't have discretion to just sort of rule what's morally correct. Um, and I think it's really important to recognize that because, you know, our movements were so used to thinking in terms of what's morally right. And we have to recognize that the government doesn't operate in that way at all. Public opinion does, and we can mobilize that, and we should. I mean, that's why we do all the communications and stuff we do, which you guys have been doing so beautifully with your art contests, your song, your music contests, and I should be wearing the T-shirt you guys sent me, but it's I forgot to put it on. But folks should check out protecttheporkies.com, right? For
Yeah,
the
we're most
shirts and the stuff
active.
that you guys produce.
Yeah, and we're most active actually on social media. I was never a person who really believed in social media, and in fact, have always actively despised it. But then when we just saw what a useful tool it was for getting ideas to spread like wildfire, and if you embrace the format of putting information in a brief, 60-second, 90-second capsule for people, rather than seeing that as a limit, to see that as just a feature of the world that we live in. Social media has been crucial to the early successes of our campaign, which we are grateful for. But so what you're describing, the government not really having any notion of morality. It's simply the government thinks about the law. Is it legal? Is it not? But then we have all these movements throughout our history where we try to update the law so that it is more in keeping with our morality, right? And that's how we've seen the expansion of rights from white property owning males to white males, period, to males, period, to male men and women, and now other groups as well. And that's where I'm really interested in the prospects of the rights of nature movement to really update the law in this country so that even if judges are only following the law, they have more flexibility, because so often it's not a yes or no when it comes to interpreting the law, right? There's many ways of interpreting the Constitution or of interpreting legal history. So I am really tantalized by the possibilities of rights of nature at the same time as it feels overwhelming based on all of the history that you've described, how moneyed interests entangled with all branches of government have really put a stranglehold on these on resisting projects, even just when it comes to protecting humans. So when it comes to speaking up for other ecosystems and life forms which don't have any representation whatsoever in government and can't vote and can't write letters or make phone calls or attend protests, it seems like something it's essential that we demand rights for nature at the same time as it's a very significant uphill battle. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts? And I'd love to hear a bit about some of the work that CELDIF has done on the rights of nature front, because it's a direction that we hope to begin sowing some seeds in our neck of the woods. We believe that Lake Superior, just simply as the largest source of surface freshwater on the continent, could be a spot where the rights of nature movement really gains a lot of traction. It's also the Great Lake, which has the highest active indigenous presence. So I believe that the ground is fertile for an idea like the rights of nature to really gain some momentum in this area.
Yeah, yeah, and you're absolutely right, Tom. I think that is so much the history of movements is about expanding those definitions of rights um, and pushing what was once outside the boundaries of law within the boundaries of law or norm. And CELDIF really got its beginning as an organization 30 years ago doing traditional regulatory environmental law, so challenging the permits that mining companies or oil and gas companies or big ag companies would use to try and get a new project going, and uh, that regulatory and permitting law work was kind of a dead end. What the organization found, I wasn't part of it at the time. I mean, I was a little kid at the time. But what they found was that working within those regulatory boundaries created a situation where we were just helping companies write permits better in many ways. Because even if we spotted problems with a permit, they were violating the law in a certain way. They were exceeding legally allowable limits of a certain pollutant or something along those lines. We would point that out, we would sue, and sometimes we would win. But then the company could just go back and reapply. They would change their plan a little bit. And if they met the definitions of what was allowed under the law, then the project would be permitted to go forward. And that was the problem fundamentally that the organization saw, is not that our regulations aren't quite strong enough to protect people. It's that our laws and legal system are set up to permit destructive activity to happen. So we kind of shift the way we think about a permit to, rather than being about, you have to get a permit in order to engage in activity to make sure that it's done in a good way. A permit is something that is the government permitting a destructive activity to happen. And it's sort of about giving them license to do their destructive activities. And we begin to see this as sort of a way of social engineering opposition to these projects. Because, let's say there were no United States federal government or state of Michigan government, and it was just you folks living up on the UP, you and all your community members, and you all kind of just had to figure out, what are we okay with, what are we not, and collectively make decisions about what are we going to do about it. If you had a mining company come in and say, we want to destroy however many hundreds of acres of land and put in toxic waste and bulldoze paths through all this old growth forest, the community would just stop that from happening in one way or another, right? Likely most people would be opposed, and they would just say, no, we're not going to allow this. You'd see a similar thing if it came to data centers or fracking, fracking right outside schools on the Colorado Front Range, right? If we didn't have a federal government or a state government that permitted these activities and said, this is legal, and if you try and stop it, we will send armed police to prevent you from stopping it, then the community would stop it. They wouldn't allow it to happen. And so CELDF kind of went through this transformation where we realized, oh, this whole process of regulation and permitting, it's not about regulating the corporations, it's about regulating us. It's about regulating community opposition to these projects and deciding what is permitted or not in terms of what the community can do. And so that's when we shifted to focus more on rights of nature, which was about how do we flip this paradigm around? How do we shift the norm such that when these projects are proposed, the standard is not, can you meet this arbitrary definition of what's acceptable and what's not for levels of certain pollutants or impacts to certain threatened species and so on. But the standard is instead based on nature's integral right to exist and flourish and naturally evolve and regenerate. And that's the baseline against which things are measured. And so the first rights of nature law was passed with CELDF's assistance. We wrote the law and worked with the community to help them pass it in Tamaqua, Pennsylvania in 2007. And since then, we've worked with dozens, hundreds of communities across the country to work on similar laws, mostly at a very local level, townships, communities, small cities, sometimes bigger cities. Pittsburgh passed a ban on fracking. And we assisted Ecuador in passing rights of nature, bringing rights of nature into their constitution back in 2009, I believe. And what we've seen throughout that is that, like you said, Tom, there's strengths of this approach, and it's not a silver bullet at the same time, right? It doesn't solve everything. I think a lot of people like to have this idea, because it's quite comforting, this idea that, if we vote for rights of nature in our community and we democratically establish this as a law, then we'll be able to stop environmental destruction without really any disruption or confrontation or challenge to it, right? It'll be a clean democratic process. It'll be entirely peaceful. There will be no confrontation, and we'll have sort of a smooth transition to a sustainable way of life. And that's a really admirable admirable thing to want. I want that. I'm sure you want that too. We all should want that. But that's not how it's played out. The reality has been that when communities have established these rights of nature laws, often they've been targeted immediately by corporate power and by the state. So one example is also in Pennsylvania, a place called Grant Township, where we helped a small rural community organize to pass a community rights and rights of nature bill at the local level. And this bill specifically banned the injection of toxic fracking waste into underground wells. That's what they do in fracking areas, is they end up with all this toxic drilling fluid that they injected underground to fracture the rock and force out the natural gas. And they just have, hundreds of thousands, millions of gallons left of this water that's contaminated with not only the chemicals that they use to help the fracking process be more effective, but also with all the materials that used to be safely locked away underground with the gas in sort of safe geological deposits. Things like heavy metals and radioactive minerals and all kinds of toxic substances. And so what they do with this is they inject it back underground. They just find a well, and they often an old oil and gas well, and they just inject it back in, and they say, oh, it won't affect groundwater. It won't get into your drinking water. It won't go into the streams. It'll all be fine because we're injecting it below the aquifers and so on. Of course, that turns out not to be true. There's been extensive coverage about this, news stories, documentaries that have researched this, lots of scientific research. It doesn't work. And so the community in Grant Township passed this law, and they were immediately sued not only by the corporation that wanted to inject this frack waste, but also by the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Quality, the agency that's supposedly about regulating and protecting environmental health. That would be like if the EPA sued an environmental group for banning some environmental harm. Under the Trump administration, that's certainly not a far-fetched thing. We sort of would expect that type of Orwellian dystopian type situation to arise. But this is what's happened. And actually, the legal battle over this is still ongoing to this day. It's been over a decade, and Seldif is still in court with the township working to try and defend them against this. There's been multiple appeals, and our organization might get fined tens of thousands of dollars for essentially bringing what some courts are saying is, frivolous legal arguments that are outside the boundaries of accepted law because of these rights of nature claims. Now, that all sounds quite negative. The positive side is they stopped the frack well, the injection well. That's the company went away. They couldn't get away with it because it wasn't just this community rights of nature bill. The community was saying, hell no, you're not going to do this, across the board in every way they could, in public comments, in protests, in showing up at meetings, in rallying. They were just determined to stop this no matter what. And so I think that's the story of rights of nature. When it's successful is when it represents this sort of groundswell of opposition to the destruction of our planet. It's not a silver bullet. Even in places where it has been established successfully, like in Toledo, Ohio, where the community voted over 60% to establish rights for another one of the Great Lakes, Lake Erie, after the drinking water supply for Toledo for something like 1 million people was cut off due to algae blooms exacerbated by pollution from factory farms, confined animal feeding operations, and the heat of global warming sort of was a supercharge on that. So it cut off their water supply. The community organized. We helped them write this rights of nature bill to give rights to Lake Erie to exist and flourish and naturally evolve and be free from pollution. And the day after that bill was passed, a group of agricultural corporations, mega businesses, sued the city to overturn that law, and the court ended up overturning the law. And so the democratic will of the people was not enacted. And so that's what we see as sort of this dynamic interplay between rights of nature and people's movements in general, it's not a silver bullet. There have been cases where it's been successful, but the way I look at it is what really needs to happen is, um, uh, the day that that sort of law is overturned, we need to have 15,000 people show up at all those agricultural, all those confined animal feeding operations in the Lake Erie watershed and shut them down and shut down their operations and blockade them day after day after day and engage in all kinds of different tactics to stop them because at that point, not only you have sort of the democratic mandate of the vote of the people. And so, this is something that we've seen in social movements, liberation struggles, revolutions throughout history, is that one tactic is rarely enough. It has to be about escalation and continuing to push and building on what happened before. And so often when you have these sort of plebiscites or public votes or expressions of public sentiment that sort of align with the movement and our goals, then we always need to have a next step, a way to keep that momentum rolling and push forward. So that's sort of where CELDF is at. We do rights of nature work right now. We helped draft a rights of nature bill for New York State that's focused on all the waters and watersheds in New York State, and that's in the state legislature right now. That's the first time it's been introduced to a state legislature in the U.S. The reality is it's very unlikely to pass, but it's part of a culture change and movement building process. It's all about pushing this deeper into the public consciousness and always using each effort to build to the next one. And so in a way, you asked about Thacker Pass earlier, Tom, and I never really finished off responding to that. When we went into Thacker Pass, we had two goals. The first one was to stop the mine. The second one was to shift the conversation, especially in the environmental movement, around electric vehicles and lithium mining as quote unquote solutions to the ecological crisis and global warming. And we failed in defending the land, but we think that we were pretty successful when it came to the second one. It wasn't just us, of course. There have been movements and opposition against lithium mining and greenwashing all over the planet that have really helped shift that conversation in some way in recent years. But I think we contributed in a very big way, and so that was part of what we were looking at, was how do we use this as sort of a springboard for the next thing. Of course, now we find ourselves in a political situation operating under the Trump administration where lithium mining and EVs are being very much, not promoted. But like you said, with Copperwood, they used to be talking about green energy, and now they're talking about national security. We're seeing much of the same narrative in the lithium economy, in so-called clean tech, and so on. And I often think of the Democrats and the Republicans as sort of these two wings of imperial bureaucrats who, between the two of them, are sort of trying to chart the path of what's going to be most effective to increase the power of this imperial project. And resource extraction is a big part of that. And so we're likely to see swings back. We're likely to see that narrative change, back in the other direction towards clean energy at some point, so-called clean energy. But yeah, in terms of rights of nature, I think it's really important. I think it's a great thing that actually right here where I live in Lane County, Oregon, there's a community group called Community Rights Lane County that helped to start this Lane County Watersheds Bill of Rights initiative process that's going to be on the ballot in May of next year, unless there's some sort of intervention by the county to say that you can't vote on this, which they have done before in Oregon and in this region. So, and I'm working with those folks to the extent that I can to try and support that, get people to show up and vote for this initiative. But, I try and tell people, even if we pass this thing in my county here, that's not the end. That's just the beginning, because then we have to figure out what does enforcement look like? Who's going to get targeted and who's not? What are the implementing processes going to look like for this law? And very importantly, how are we going to respond when the timber companies who want to spray in all the watersheds, they want to spray toxic chemicals, and all the other extractive industries in the region start to sue the county over this law and say this is an illegal law, we're suing to get it overturned. How do we respond to that? Because that is basically inevitable if the law passes. So the rights of nature, even if we do get it passed and encoded in local law, that's very much not the end of a process. It's just the beginning. And our movements need to understand that.
Right. I mean, we see with human rights, just the right to free speech, for example, that's guaranteed in the Constitution. That doesn't mean it's going to be enforced or respected, but it does provide an important symbol that gives us legally the flexibility to make a better world. Your point about going into Thacker Pass, how you had two goals: the first, obviously, to stop the mine, but the second, to shift the conversation. Our campaign, I think, resonates deeply with that message. We've always said that our three goals are to stop the mine. The second is to build a network which can live on regardless of the outcome of the mine. And the third is to have fun, because I think if our main fuel in any sort of campaign is doom and gloom, that's not a sustainable fuel. That will really get people to burn out and tune out and want to go back to just sedating themselves with television. But if we feel like we are actually enjoying getting educated on these topics and then fighting for what we know is true, regardless of the outcome, that helps to really augment that second goal of building the network. And in my mind, I think of it kind of like how, the traditional analogy is a grassroots movement. I think these days more and more people resonate with mushrooms and mycelia. And, the way mycelia works is it's all about decentralized network building, right? You get a number of spores on a substrate, and the threads all start to reach out and connect with each other. And once you get a certain density of connections, there's nobody calling the shots, there's no leader here. But once you get enough connections, then a mushroom sprouts when the conditions are right. And then even if you have some idiot come by and stomp down the mushroom on their hike, the network under the ground is still there and can actually keep getting stronger and stronger. And then you get another big rain, and maybe the second flush is even bigger than the first time. So maybe who knows what's going to happen with Copperwood? Maybe we don't beat the Copperwood mine. I think we're going to, because we need to project positivity, right? But even if it doesn't happen, our network is growing. We've now got around 60,000 people on social media who are interested in being informed, and not only being informed, but being active and taking whatever action they can. And that is a network that we're going to continue to grow, and we hope to utilize it in the coming year, starting in January, with regards to laying the foundation for a more comprehensive rights of nature movement, specifically in the Lake Superior and Lake Michigan watersheds, but in the Great Lakes region in general. And, one of the reasons that we in our campaign have focused so much on the cultural side of things in terms of having art contests and music contests is that I really think, if you think of the way change happens in the world as like a river. By the time government passes something, you're already way down at the mouth of the river. You're not quite at the mouth of the river, because the mouth is what is actually enforced, which is only a fraction of what the government approves. But in order to get something to happen on the legal front, first you need all of that cultural change happening way upstream. So, I think we've got a lot of brilliant people who are able to put the necessary information out there and educate people, but we also need to change how people feel in relation to the natural world. And that's where I think the arts and music and culture more broadly are crucial. And I would love to see the rights of nature really be a rallying cry for a whole new era of art and cultural change, because it's incredibly disruptive, this idea that rights shouldn't only apply to humans, and not even to humans, to persons, right? Corporations and cities. And I think when we recognize that the way the law works is entirely fictitious. Who is a person, who is not a person. It's a useful fiction which furthers certain agendas. And so if you suggest to somebody, maybe Lake Superior could be considered a person, the first thing they're going to do is, of course, laugh in your face. But then when you tell them, well, Walmart is a person, Cincinnati is a person, the gears start to turn. And when we recognize that something is a fiction, then the only question is, what is the fairest way of utilizing this fiction so that we get an outcome which is beneficial to everybody. In the case of Ecuador, I think that was a very ideal situation in which rights of nature were implemented at the highest level, because so many of the cases that you've been describing are local communities which implement rights of nature, but then they get challenged by so-called higher levels of government. So I sometimes fantasize about, will we ever have a volatile moment in the future of the US in which a new constitution might be drafted, in which more rights or better rights might be more clearly defined. But, in the meantime, I think so much of what you're describing in the history of social change and cultural change, it's very much two steps forward, one step back, sometimes three steps back. So we have to have a mix of patience and impatience, right? We need to feel the urgency that the natural world is being destroyed right now, and we need to do something about it. But also the zoomed out patience of recognizing that these things do take time. By the time women were given the right to vote in this country, or recognized with the right to vote, how many decades, how many centuries did it take to lay the groundwork for that moment? And so, with regards to the rights of nature, we're probably going to see quite a number of defeats on the way to a more substantial, comprehensive victory. But that's where, if we adjust our goals, as you guys did with the Thacker Pass campaign, as we're trying to do with Protect the Porkies, it's not only about the outcome, the single outcome of victory, right? It's about the larger picture of expanding the network, changing the conversation, and understanding that things take a lot of time. That we might not even see the victories that we're looking for in our lifetimes. Of course, we won't. Of course, there are going to be fights to come for many generations. But I think if we keep people positive and excited about being involved now, that is the absolute best thing we can do. Um, I wonder if you and Seldif would have any recommendations for us moving forward as we try to both educate and inspire to action our community in the Michigan and upper Midwest area around the rights of nature. One question that I have is, does it make sense to fight for rights of individual entities like Lake Superior, specifically Lake Michigan, or the Great Lakes as a whole system? Of course, that brings in different states, different countries potentially, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on just, if we want to begin a rights of nature movement in our neck of the woods, or encourage the one that is already there, what steps do you think we should take to get the ball rolling?
Yeah, well, a couple thoughts. First, I should say up front that I'm not an expert in the rights of nature movement. I joined CELDIF just over a year ago, and I've followed their work for many years and been friends with folks in the organization, been following rights of nature for a long time, but I'm not an expert. And if you really want an expert, you should talk to my colleague, Ben Price, who I know you know, who, organized in Tamaqua to help pass that first ever rights of nature law in the US, in anywhere in the Western world, in the Western legal system. Excuse me. But I can say a few things. One is that there's certainly a debate about whether it's better to focus on sort of one entity or broader perspectives. Um, the argument for focusing on one entity is similar to that made by conservationists and environmentalists who've said that, if we protect the grizzly bear, for example, they need so much habitat and they have such a wide range that we're not just protecting the grizzly bear, we're protecting the forest and the insects and the birds and the rivers and everything and everyone who is around where the grizzly bears live. And that's a reasonable argument in some ways. There's folks in Oceania right now working to protect, to bring a rights of nature perspective for whales, right? But because of a specific cultural tradition, ancestral tradition of reverence for whales in this Polynesian culture, and that makes a lot of sense in some ways. There's also, to some extent, there's a risk in that, because the risk is that you sort of end up creating sort of a zoo approach to conserving animals, or conserving the land, or protecting our kin on this planet, in which, for example, similar to the Endangered Species Act, proponents of the Endangered Species Act will say it's protected 99 point something percent of the species that have been listed under it from going extinct. But what most of those species are still sort of just hovering along at these very low numbers. Very few of them have actually recovered significantly to be really stable and anything close to what their populations used to be. So it's sort of like a life support mechanism. And obviously that's not the intent of the rights of nature approaches that focus on one entity. But there is that risk that you end up sort of with a bit of a blinkered perspective, blinkered focus on this one organism. So CELDF has been an advocate for taking broader sort of ecosystem level perspectives. That's why the New York State Waters Bill of Rights, Great Lakes and State Waters Bill of Rights, is about protecting not just one lake, but all the lakes and watersheds in the state. And that's a bigger fight, but our argument has been that it's kind of important to hold that line, to not get too sort of siloed in the way that we think about these things, where we start to believe that this lake matters and this one doesn't. And another example of that is that CELDF has argued against a personhood for nature approach, because the problem is that we've seen that approach be weaponized against nature in some ways. So, for example, we've seen that when rights of nature with a personhood approach has been extended to a given river, then a mining company might, for example, turn around and sue the river as a legal person and say, this river, which has just flooded into our operations, has violated our rights, has violated our property boundaries, and trespassed on our land, and so on. And so we need monetary damages from the river or something like that. Or we need the right to do X, Y, Z that we would have been otherwise not permitted to do. And so there's sort of a vulnerability that gets opened in that personhood approach as well. So again, our approach there has been to say, no, we shouldn't look at nature as legal persons. We shouldn't look at a river or a lake as a person, because it's not a person. It is different than me and you. That doesn't mean it's less than, but we should avoid using that sort of limited legal construct to refer to something that doesn't fit inside that, an entity that doesn't fit inside that box. So we're actually working on a report that's, hopefully it'll be coming out early 2026. We're calling it the State of Rights of Nature. And that report is going to be diving into some of the examples that I just talked about, some things that we've seen around the world that we're concerned about, with a bit of greenwashing creeping into how rights of nature is being approached in some areas. And it's our attempt to sort of right the ship, to get things back on track, and to keep rights of nature with this sort of focused biocentric perspective in which we are really advocating, again, for the fundamental rights of the natural world, the ecosystems that we live in, the communities that we're a part of, the natural communities that we're a part of, to have an inherent right to exist and thrive and evolve and grow and change outside of our human constructs. And I mean, I look forward to that report. I think it's going to be powerful. And I just want to echo too, Tom, something you said a minute ago about the importance of people taking responsibility for action. Yeah, I like that you emphasized how from the beginning of your campaign there, you've tried to get people to take responsibility, to take action themselves in this sort of horizontalist approach, that nobody's going to come save us from the outside. It's all of us together who are going to do it. I actually wrote a piece about that just last night that I published on my newsletter, Biocentric, because I was having a conversation with a friend here locally and asking them if they had political contacts who might be willing to help with a campaign that we're working on. And they said they could only think of one person. And it just sparked me to think about the importance of building relationships and building connections, not just relying on organizations or groups to do that for us, but understanding that we all have a responsibility to be prepared to meet this time that we find ourselves in, and to step up and to take action and to contribute in some meaningful way. And so I really appreciate the way that you guys have done that through, bringing in art and creativity. And I know you and Sol are amazing artists. Your book, Reynard the House Wolf, is a wonderful thing for people who haven't seen it. So I think that's such a beautiful and important approach.
Well, thank you, Max. And you're inspiring me also to want to reach out to Ben Price, because I really want to make sure that we are well educated on the current state of the most responsible way for the rights of nature movement to move forward before we start getting our hands dirty. I'm also far from an expert in the movement, but it's something that I feel a lot of resonance with on a personal level. And I also feel like the ground is fertile in Michigan specifically, just because of the magnanimous quantity of fresh water there, and also because of the current political situation. I myself am not really a party person. That said, I don't think Republicans will ever be introducing rights of nature bills at the moment. So it will fall on the Democrats in Michigan. And because there has just been a pretty big shift, the Republicans have taken control of the House on the federal level. Republicans are in charge. I think we do have a few lawmakers, Democratic lawmakers in Michigan, who might think, we're not going to be able to get a lot done right now. So maybe let's try some things that are more creative and more unconventional. You're not really putting a lot on the line just to introduce a bill. Like you said, there's been a rights of nature, rights of the Great Lakes bill introduced in New York, which may or may not pass. But a lawmaker doesn't lose anything by simply getting a bill introduced. So that is one goal that we have for the coming years, is to try to get a bill introduced to show solidarity with the eastern end of the Great Lakes chain, so that we can start looking, as you say, not just a piecemeal protecting this entity and then that one, but a more holistic movement in which we recognize that everything is connected in nature. That's basically the first law of ecology. So let's try to make a more fundamental change.
Yeah, I love that, Tom, and I'll look forward to having conversations with you about this in the future. Hopefully Ben and Selduf can assist you guys out there to make some progress in this effort. And I better get going here. Is there anything you want to wrap up with before we close this conversation?
Nope, I really enjoyed chatting, and I'm coming out of this feeling very inspired, lots of fresh ideas. So I look forward to building this relationship in the future.
Thank you, Tom, for taking the time. I really appreciate the conversation too, and admire what you guys are doing out there. So keep up the good work. I want to thank you for listening to our show and let you know a few ways you can support Truth and Reckoning. First, share this broadcast with your friends and family. Leave a positive review via your podcast app. Visit the Truth and Reckoning YouTube channel and leave a thumbs up and a comment. The full scope of the work of Selduf, including this show, comes with a financial cost. So if you're able to make a donation, go to celdf.org. That's selduf.org. But most importantly, our goal for this show is to empower you to take action. So the best way you can show your support is to get involved with your community and protecting the place where you live. Thank you very much.